Yes, certainly, Gabriel. I was in Vietnam for 8 months, not the full year that most people spent, because I didn't go up as part of a unit. I was sent up as what was called a reinforcement, a replacement, if you like, for another officer who had either gone back to Australia because he was a national serviceman whose time was up, or some other reason. He might have been posted elsewhere. But whatever the reason, I was sent up as a reinforcement rather than as part of a unit. So I went up on my own. I had a rather different experience to most people, in that I was an officer as a national serviceman. Not many national servicemen became officers. You had to do a 6-month course in Australia, and it was a very, very intensive course. After that course, I did a further 3 months of training in artillery, I spent a bit of time in Australia after that as assistant adjutant and adjutant of a large artillery unit, and that is the adjutant's job, is to look after the administration of the regiment. That was very difficult, particularly halfway through my time of being an assistant adjutant or adjutant, because the adjutant disappeared. He was my commander, my senior officer, I should say, and he was a captain. I was a second lieutenant, and when he was posted away from the unit, I had to do the job of a captain. I found that very stressful as a second lieutenant with no one to assist me. After that, my commanding officer selected me to be sent up to Vietnam as a reinforcement. And so I spent 8 months in Vietnam as a artillery section commander. Now, an artillery battery consists of 6 105mm howitzers, and as a section commander, I commanded half the battery, that is 3 of those howitzers. And I spent most of my time in Vietnam as a section commander, but also a large amount of time relieving the gun position officer who was in charge of the firing of the whole battery. He had to sleep and eat and that sort of thing, and so myself and the other section commander in the battery took turns in relieving him in the command post. I also spent a bit of time as artillery, as task force, artillery liaison officer, based in the province capital of Phuc Tuy, which was called Baria, and that was sector headquarters, and it was staffed by American officers, South Vietnamese officers, and myself and 2 signallers. And our job there was, or my job there was, to make sure that our allies, the Americans and South Vietnamese, didn't accidentally fire artillery into the area where our troops were operating. So that was what I did in Vietnam for 8 months.
I was similar to Andrew. I was a reinforcement. I was a member of C Squadron 1st Armoured Regiment, which is the Centurion tanks, which is a British tank, and it fires 20-pounder main gun. And my role in the tank was a gunner. I was trained as a gunner, a radio operator, loader, and I did my tank training at Puckapunyal. At the time I was finished my training, I was posted to C Squadron 1st Armoured Regiment. There were no tanks in Vietnam. There were APCs, or armoured personnel carriers, that carried the troops around, but there were no tanks. After being in the squadron for about 2 or 3 weeks, the Australian government sent tanks to Vietnam. So that was 1968. So I was in Vietnam as a tank gunner from 1968 to February 1969. if you're claustrophobic or you didn't like the heat, you didn't want to be in a tank, I can tell you. And there was no air conditioning or anything like that. Thought we were pretty safe in the tank, and I've got a couple of photos I'll show you before we leave. I've been in country for about 6 months. We've been in a lot of firefights. A lot of the rounds would just ping off the top of the turret. I'm talking about light arms, machine guns and so on. And but we run over a mine, big one, and it blew all the tracks and lifted the tank off the ground. And none of us were hurt, thank God, but made a mess to the tracks. And I thought, well, that's my lucky one. We got through that. And about 3 weeks later, we went out on another operation with the infantry. We were supporting the infantry. One troop of tanks, and in a troop of tanks there's 4 tanks. And we worked with a company of infantry, which is about 150 guys. And we went in a really thick jungle, and we were looking for what we called, first of all, a rice cache, because the Viet Cong were real cunning. They didn't carry a lot of their food. They used to have these drops, so they didn't have to carry it, but they had them buried and all that kind of stuff. And they'd pick up their food and move on. They did the same with their ammunition, and they'd hide it and wrap it in plastic so it didn't rust or anything like that. But and we got to the food cache, and they got there before us. We got rid of some of it, and then we moved on the next day and to this ammunition cache, and we were working with the infantry and B Company 4R, and we went through a clearing into and we got to some very thick jungle, and the forward scouts moved into the jungle in front of us. 2 guys in each platoon. We were in the centre tank. There were only 3 tanks. One had broken down, going out, and all of a sudden we heard 2 loud explosions, and we realised there'd been a contact with our infantry, with the VC. And we were told to move in. My crew commander said to me, to the driver, "Look, drive in." It was just thick jungle. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We got in to where the forward scouts got hit. And what the VC had done is they put claymore mines up a tree, and they were an American mine with a whole lot of ball bearings, explosive behind it, detonated. We used them as perimeter protection. Andrew would have seen plenty of them. And at night we'd use them. And but the VC had pinched these from the Yanks, and they set them up a tree and they exploded the claymore mines. One forward scout was killed instantly. He was just blown to pieces. And the other guy lost half his face and arm and part of his leg because he walked sideways. We got to where they were, and he was yelling a bit. And we moved a little bit past them, and my crew commander said to the driver, "Stop. He said to me I'm looking through a scope where I'm sitting in the belly of the tank. What can you see in front?" And I said, "Only leaves against the scope at the top." And he said, "Well, I want you to put the gun at 12 o'clock and fire a canister round, which is like a big shotgun round, huge. And that gives a 30-degree arc," and just blew all the foliage away. And I could see all these bunker system like a horseshoe in front of us, about 30 yards, maybe 50 metres in front of us. And he said, "Now traverse the turret to 9 o'clock, fire another one, and then 3 o'clock. So at 180-degree arc in front of us. At this stage they were firing small arms, and he just said, "Keep firing the canister," because the infantry were then moved up and they were behind us on the ground. And we run out of canister, and he said, "Well, fire some HE, which is high explosive." The trouble with high explosive rounds is if you hit a tree, when it hits, it detonates, whereas the canister's just like the shotgun, it's got no explosive. So I said, "Well, I can't fire HE because the infantry behind." So I started firing them, depressed the barrel really low, and I started firing machine guns into the slits. They were logs and sandbags. I've got a photo of them here, I'll show you later. And then the machine gun jammed. So while the loader is unjamming the machine gun, I fired, that was a 50 calibre, which is quite a big machine gun, a Browning. I started firing the other one, which is 30 calibre, which are those rounds I showed you out there. And it jammed. So while the loader's trying to do both, 2 Viet Cong, we think, One jumped out to the right, one jumped out to the left with an RPG, which is the big rocket-propelled grenades. And from 50 metres, they fired 3 rounds. And 3 rounds penetrated the turret and blew up. We were all badly wounded. The driver was unconscious. We couldn't back out. The other tank on the right was about 100 metres to our right. The other one on the left was the same. They eventually heard that we got hit. So they backtracked and followed our track into the jungle and pulled up to the right of us. But in the meantime, we couldn't breathe. Everything was sparking, all the electrics were going. My crew commander had most of his legs blown away. They were still attached. So we couldn't stay there, couldn't breathe. We had to get out. And they were then starting to fire small arms, machine gun, like AK-47. And he got out, bailed out, lifted himself up with his elbows and rolled off the top of the turret. My loader went out his hatch, he's got a hatch on his side. And it's my turn. I could hear these rounds zinging across the top. Well, as soon as I stick my head out, I'm sure to cop one. Had to keep going. I rolled out. We then came around and dragged the crew commander. He was out about 10 yards out from the side where he rolled off. He had all his pants had been blown off and he was in a mess. So the loader and myself dragged him back under the back of the tank, under a big petrol tank. And we took our shirts off. I copped it all the shrapnel in the back where I was sitting. And so I had metal coming out of me. My loader had his kneecap blown off. The driver's unconscious, we didn't know how he was, because he sits out the front, not in the turret. And when the other tank pulled up and started firing, they kept their heads down, the VC, and the medics come up and they dragged us back out. We were taken from there. There was 2 scouts. One died in the helicopter with me, the one that was badly wounded. He died in the helicopter with me. The American helicopters picked us up, Hueys, and it was about 20 minutes, half an hour from where we were to the Australian hospital at Vung Tau. And I spent 2 weeks in hospital in Vietnam, about another 2 weeks in Australia, and then I was out of the army. My 2 years were up. So I was supposed to be there for 12 months, and I did just on 10 months. And I was counting the weeks off to coming home. I didn't quite make it. So it was an experience, and I've done a couple of interviews for the War Memorial. It was an experience that I wouldn't want to go through again. But at the same time, the way we were looked after by our own guys and the doctors and the nurses and things over there was just fantastic. Now, I've probably told a lot more there than I would often say to a student. But I think that you need to know that war's not nice. Luckily, all our guys in my crew survived. 2 of them are now gone through cancer, but that's separate since they come back. I think that the young people these days need to know we're not here to glorify war. That's the last thing we want. But why we do talk about it now, and we didn't in the past, a lot of the First World War, Second World War diggers wouldn't talk about it. A lot of them were suffering what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. And they were either shell-shocked or jungle fever, all these terms came out. But we think that the young people need to know, because we want no more wars. None.
Exactly.
We don't want any more. We've got to have a military to protect our own interests, sure. But we don't want wars, I tell you. They're awful.
Yeah,
And Andrew would agree, wouldn't you?
Totally.
I'm sorry I've given you a bit more detail than you probably want.
it's alright, because we need to know about that war, as you said, war is not nice.
No.
Yeah.